Right, I'm going to record what I presented to you in class earlier, but I said I'd put up a recording. Apologies for the delay on this. It's about the important author Ben Jonson. Now, the dominant focus of this course has been on the metaphysical poets, in large part, perhaps because of personal preference, but I truly regard the metaphysical poets as great poets. And whether that is we're speaking of John Donne, or whether we're speaking of George Herbert, whether we're speaking of Andrew Marvell, or some of the later metaphysical poets like Vaughan and Traherne, I think we can see a consistent greatness there that nonetheless shows significant difference between the poets in terms of their temperament, in terms of their literary devices and style, and yet shows a commonality to it, but also one which changes over the course of the 17th century, much as the new philosophy sets itself into the mindset of the age. We see changes there, and also the political context of the English Civil War is obviously transformative for the thinking of the day. But I've neglected Ben Jonson on the course thus far. And I don't want to omit him altogether, because Jonson is a playwright and a poet almost without peer in the period. And he has a lasting influence. After Shakespeare, arguably the greatest English dramatist, and in his day, perhaps seen as the greatest. During the reign of James I. Jonson was born in 1572, dies in 1637. So again, he is largely before the English Civil War. And so he comes in, he's in the timeline of Shakespeare, overlapping there, and also of John Donne. And he is a classicist who regarded Donne's metaphysical style of poetry, with its abruptness and its breach of form, as deserving the whip for his breach. And Jonson was, as a child of the Renaissance, classically educated, and he was enormously cultivated. But he had an appetite for controversy, and he got into all sorts of scraps. In fact, at one point, he got into serious trouble on that front. But in midlife, he claimed that his paternal grandfather, who served Henry VIII, was connected with the Johnston family up in Dumfries in Scotland, and so he had been deprived of his inheritance. So very interesting on that fact. He went to Westminster School, and then from there up to Cambridge, where he continued his learning, and became, as I say, one of the most learned men of his day, and known for his epigrammatic poetry. Now, in terms of his convictions, his father was a Protestant until the reign of Bloody Mary, at which point he suffered imprisonment and lost his wealth when Mary tried to turn England back to Catholicism. When her sister, Elizabeth, acceded to the throne, he was freed from prison, and he was able to travel to London, and he became a clergyman. Now, that's Jonson's father. And that's simply the record from Jonson himself. And when he was 7, as I say, he went to Westminster School, which was part of Westminster Abbey at the time. But he maintained an interest in Catholic doctrine through his adult life. And when the war with Spain was particularly hot and heavy during the Armada, etc., and the persecution of Catholics was intensifying, he actually converted in 1598. And he was remanded in Newgate jail and charged with manslaughter. As I said, he was a man of considerable controversy. And there are those who have questioned and discussed this, but he was convicted and converted. He was given the possibility here of accepting conversion to the Anglican faith, but he remained Catholic. And that was tolerated, but obviously not did not well please the monarchs of the day. But he was terrific as a playwright, but I'm not looking at him as a playwright for the purposes of this course. I want to look at him as a poet. And the first poem I want to look at is simply, quite simply, touching. And it really, to my mind, expresses much of the beauty of Jonson's poetry, the epigrammatic nature. The epigram is a very short form of writing, and he will occasionally write two-line epigrams. In fact, often. These are not epigrams that we're going to look at. They are brief, pithy, and restrained lyrics in which the ideals of classicism of our man that we looked at, Horace, are being expressed, of modesty and decorum and restraint. And yet within that restraint and within that modesty, with all of the decorum of Jonson's poetry, it's enormously powerful the way he's able to evoke the passions that he feels at instances in his own life, some of which I'm going to reveal here simply by reading the poems. And the first one is called On My First Daughter, and you'll find it rather striking. On my first daughter, here lies to each her parents' ruth, Mary, the daughter of their youth. Yet all heaven's gifts, being heaven's due, it makes the father less to rue. At 6 months and she parted hence with safety of her innocence, whose soul, heaven's queen, whose name she bears, in comfort of her mother's tears, hath placed amongst her virgin train, where, while that severed doth remain, this grave partakes the fleshly birth, which cover lightly gentle earth. So this is a moving poem, and it's on his first daughter, but it's the loss of his first daughter. His daughter dies at the age of 6 months. And he is consoled by his faith and his knowledge that his daughter is with Mary, Queen of Heaven, and comforted there and placed in the midst of her virgin train. And yet he returns in the tail of the poem to himself. So having begun with himself and his wife and their ruth, their grief at her loss, having consoled himself with the consolation, namely that it is she, as one of heaven's gifts, belongs to heaven and can be brought back, and it does console him, he's still reminded of the fact that he's lost his daughter. And so here, while that severed doth remain, what's that? The body. This grave partakes the fleshly birth, which cover lightly gentle earth. And the command given with the force of a invitation, really, to be gentle with his little gentle daughter who has passed away, expresses the feelings of the author towards his dear daughter, the gentleness of the grieving father, wonderfully, admirably expressed. We're going to find this is not the only instance of grief in Jonson's life, because the second poem we're going to look at expresses much the same. On My First Son. Tough times. On my first son. Farewell, thou child of my right hand and joy. My sin was too much hope of thee, loved boy. 7 years thou wert lent to me, and I thee pay, exacted by thy fate on the just day. Oh, could I lose all father now? For why will man lament the state he should envy? to have so soon scaped worlds and flesh's rage, and if no other misery, yet age. Rest in soft peace, and asked, say, here doth lie Ben Jonson, his best work of poetry, for whose sake henceforth all his vows be such as what he loves may never like too much. So the tone of the poem, much like the previous one, begins with a direct address to not only his child, but his own sense of loss, but then moves to a phase of consolation. And the consolation is a theological one, the tenets of his faith. His child is with God. He's escaped the travails of this life, the world's and the flesh's rage, and if no other misery yet, age. So he's escaped all of these things by dying at the age of 7. But that consolation cannot wholly cover, and rightly does not wholly cover, let alone forget, the loss that he's in fact suffered. And the loss is that which is admirably expressed in this little line, here doth lie Ben Jonson, his best piece of poetry. Jonson is a renowned poet, a famous poet. His most famous offspring in his own mind, progeny, is his son, whom he has just buried. And the broken heart of the father is revealed in the quiet grief expressed in the final 2 lines, for whose sake henceforth all his vows be such as what he loves may never like too much. This tension between love and like, and the sense in which our loves are competing with the love of caritas, of charity, which he knows should rule over his thoughts and feelings. Nonetheless, he acknowledges that he is bound to his son, not only in his grief, but in his joys, in his memories, and so much so that he regards him as his very best piece of poetry. I think it's enormously touching. Note this is classicism. Note the restraint. Note the decorum. Note the way in which strong feeling is yet couched in terms that would seek to express it in a acceptable fashion, so that we're not looking away from Jonson and to some degree grieving his grief, but rather moved by it and drawn to be compassionate. Note how very different the tone is and the ideals are of the classicist to that of the metaphysical poet, particularly Donne, who is all bombast and power and conflict and contradiction and joy and delight and exuberance. Here we get those none of those youthful virtues. We have the wise restraint of an older man, or at least a wiser head. That's what we have in Jonson, I think, characteristic of Jonson and the classicism of this age. Let's look at another poem here. This one's called Song to Celia. Famous one at that. Drink to me only with thine eyes, and I will pledge with mine. Or leave a kiss but in the cup, and I'll not look for wine. The thirst that from the soul doth rise, doth ask a drink divine. But might I of Jove's nectar sup, I would not change for thine. I sent thee late a rosy wreath, not so much honoring thee, as giving it a hope that there it could not withered be. But thou thereon didst only breathe, and sentest it back to me. Since when it grows and smells, I swear, not of itself, but thee. So this is restrained, and it's a love poem. And yet it is enormously sentimental. The wreath of roses that he sent to her, he's received back, and it bears the scent of her breath. And I don't think he's complaining. He's talking how he is what he gave to her out of tribute to her love, to honor her. She has returned to him, perhaps has been rejected, but at any rate, he wants something of her. And that something may only be not the desires of Donne, of the courtly lover, some sort of adulterous affair. He's satisfied with the look, the drink from her eyes, which he also pledges. So he uses this analogy of toasting and pledging one another's good health, which is going to console him and satisfy him rather than going down the path of, again, the Petrarchan lovers and the courtly love iniquity. So again, restraint, and yet passion visibly captivated in the wonderful little lyric poem here. If you note the rhyme scheme, the eyes and rise rhyme, the mine and wine, the cup and the sup, you can see there's an alternation between the lines here, wonderfully composed, metrically regular, and yet with no sense in which we would become bored with the rhyme scheme. So it's a wonderful model of decorum in every line, and certainly in the whole. So that's the song to Celia. Let me look at Claremont's song. Claremont's song: still to be neat, still to be dressed, as you were going to a feast, still to be powdered, still perfumed, lady it is to be presumed, though art's hid causes are not found, all is not sweet, all is not sound. Give me a look, give me a face that makes simplicity a grace, robes loosely flowing, hair as free, such sweet neglect more taketh me than all the adulteries of art. They strike mine eyes, but not my heart. Now, Claremont's song is actually addressed purportedly to the clothing or the apparel of a woman. But really, it is more than that. It is really about art and the right relation of culture to nature. And the tendency, and this is characteristic of classicism, though perhaps less so to neoclassicism, of a certain element of disorder, just a little bit, that breaks the monotony of regularity. And so Jonson here avers the classical ideals of having, yes, a repetition of form, but also a slight bit of variation, just a deviation, enough to break the monotony, but also add a little bit of excitement to it. And note that it comes at the tail end of the poem, so it surprises us to some degree. So, and he speaks explicitly of art, and in two places, in the penultimate line of the first stanza and also the penultimate line of the second stanza. Though art's hid causes are not found, all is not sweet, all is not sound. And then finally, with a robes loosely flowing, hair as free, so not bound up, such sweet neglect more taketh me than all the adulteries of art. So following the form rigorously. So there's an element of nature breaking out from culture, which is very classical, yes, but it's also very much English. There's a delight in a little bit of wildness or of nature, which is escaping culture. There's a sense that cultures can be oppressive. And there's a sense of freedom there, which is expressed in this liberation of nature from culture. And Jonson exemplifies it very well in this song, Claremont's song. And finally, let me look at the tribute that Jonson gives to his beloved friend, the author, Mr. William Shakespeare. Now, this one's a little bit longer, and I'm not going to comment too much, other than to say that here is a tribute of a man who is a playwright, much like Shakespeare, and whose praise, therefore, is as much as one could hope as a fellow playwright. It's from somebody who knows enough to esteem his greatness, and yet to see differences in Shakespeare's art and method to that of his own. Jonson is famous as a wit and as a humorist. To this day, you can see his plays performed at Stratford, Volpone, and others. But this tribute shows genuine appreciation of Shakespeare's novelty and his deviance from the norms to some degree, such as you would not expect from a classicist necessarily. But let me read it. To draw no envy, Shakespeare, on thy name, am I thus ample to thy book and fame? While I confess thy writings to be such as neither man nor muse can praise too much, 'tis true, and all men's suffrage. But these ways were not the paths I meant unto thy praise. For Celia's ignorance on these may light, which, when it sounds at best, but echoes right. Or blind affection, which doth ne'er advance the truth, but gropes and urgeth all by chance. Or crafty malice might pretend this praise, and think to ruin where it seemed to raise. These are as some infamous bawd or whore should praise a matron. What could hurt her more? But thou art proof against them, and indeed above the ill fortune of them or the need. I therefore will begin. Soul of the age, the applause delight, the wonder of our stage. My Shakespeare, rise. I will not lodge thee by Chaucer or Spenser, or bid Beaumont lie a little further to make thee a room. Thou art a monument without a tomb, and art alive still while thy book doth live, and we have wits to read and praise to give. That I not mix thee so, my brain excuses. I mean with great but disproportioned muses, for if I thought my judgment were of years, I should commit thee surely with thy peers, and tell how far thou didst our Lyly outshine, or Sporting Kid, or Marlowe's mighty line. And though thou hadst small Latin and less Greek, from thence to honor thee, I would not seek for names, but call forth thundering Aeschylus, Euripides and Sophocles to us, Pacuvius, Accius, him of Cordova dead, to life again, to hear thy buskin tread, and shake a stage, or when thy socks were on, leave thee alone for the comparison of all that insolent Greece or haughty Rome sent forth, or since did from their ashes come. Triumph, my Britain, thou hast one to show to whom all scenes of Europe homage owe. He was not of an age, but for all time, and all the muses still were in their prime, when like Apollo he came forth to warm our ears, or like a Mercury to charm. Nature herself was proud of his designs, and joyed to wear the dressing of his lines, which were so richly spun and woven so fit, as since she will vouchsafe no other wit. The merry Greek, tart Aristophanes, neat Terence, witty Plautus, now not please, but antiquated and deserted lie, as they were not of nature's family. Yet must I not give nature all? Thy art, my gentle Shakespeare, must enjoy a part. For though the poet's matter nature be, his art doth give the fashion, and that he who casts to write a living line must sweat, such as thine are, and strike the second heat upon the muse's anvil, turn the same and himself with it, that he thinks to frame, or for the laurel he may gain a scorn for a good poet's made as well as born. And such wert thou. Look how the father's face lives in his issue. Even so, the race of Shakespeare's mind and manners brightly shines in his well-turned and true-filed lines, in each of which he seems to shake a lance, as brandished at the eyes of ignorance. Sweet swan of Avon, what a sight it were to see thee in our waters yet appear, and make those flights upon the banks of Thames that did so take Eliza and our James. But stay, I see thee in the hemisphere advanced, and made a constellation there. Shine forth, thou star of poets, and with rage or influence chide or cheer the drooping stage, which, since thy flight from hence, hath mourned like night, and despair's day, but for thy volume's light. Wonderful tribute. Just a couple of comments, if I can find this. Here, the buskin and the socks. The buskin is a boot that is worn and would be worn historically in ancient Greece for tragedy. It has a heel on it. It makes a noise on the stage, where socks are worn for comedy. Shakespeare's, of course, famed for both his comedies and his tragedies. And he brooks historical comparison. So his histories, so Shakespeare's corpus tends to be divided in the three forms of comedy, tragedy, and history. And Jonson, the classicist, compares him to the mighty writers of ancient Greece and Rome on all of these fronts. And so high praise from a classicist that he should court comparison with the greatest writers in the whole history of literature. But so high is his praise of Shakespeare. It's a rightful panegyric that I think it befits a man of Jonson's ability, but also of the man he praises, William Shakespeare. I thought it would be a fitting end to our little look at Jonson. Thank you.